Hello, Kyle. Mr. Kyle Koch, rocking the Evolve Move Play sweatshirt right at the moment. So, for folks who've been around the Evolve Move Play community for a while, or folks who have followed the podcast tightly, you'll know Kyle. Kyle's one of our senior head coaches, and he is a primary workshop coach on the West Coast of the United States. He's traveling right now. He's in San Diego to teach a workshop this weekend. He's scouting out trees. You can see in the background behind him, which is cool. You got a better background than me, Kyle.
I got to
So
represent since my interview with John. I got to keep the nature backgrounds.
yeah, yeah. So we just wanted to kind of dial in and have a little chat because I think it's been a little while since people have seen you on this format and gotten a chance to kind of talk about what you're doing, and you're taking EMP on the road and sharing it with people, and you really, since I think the last time that we had you on the podcast, or at least I guess we had you on the podcast with Aaron back in the fall, which is a great interview. Um, but since the previous time we had on the podcast, you've been diving incredibly deep into John's work and all the dialogical practices that come out of that. So lots to get to. Um, yeah, let's remind people kind of where you came from. What's your hero story? Once upon a time, there was a young Kyle who was an IT tech, and then something happened.
Yeah, I emerged from the suburban town of West Bend, Wisconsin. And yeah, I fell quickly into the trap of modernity of getting a job and pursuing a career in the corporate world, specifically in the field of IT. And it was super fun. And I was really interested in that problem solving space and all of the intricacies of it. But pretty quickly, I felt uninspired. I felt very much like this was a job and it wasn't meaningful. And I realized like nobody ever called me because they wanted to talk to me, you know, which is totally different now when I talk to people on EMP retreat calls. They're super stoked and we have really amazing conversations. But people typically called me with problems that were definitely my fault as a representative of the software company. And that just really wore on me over time. I was just like, oh, like nobody is stoked, and they're not accepting, they make it so personal. And that just wore on me. And I also found that I didn't really have any tangible skills outside of a computer and electricity and the internet, that if our phones were down, we would you know, just throw CDs and bullshit and play little games and stuff like that. And at the same time, I was watching a lot of the wilderness survival shows, Man versus Wild, Dual Survival, all those kind of things. And I felt really inspired by that. And the turning point in the hero's journey was the moment that I made fire
Hmm.
using a primitive technique, the bow drill, rubbing the sticks together and blowing this little tinder bundle into flames was a turning point, was a realization of the deep potential that resides within me when I come into relationship with myself and a place. And that pretty much just sent me on the journey of what else am I capable of. Um, yeah, leading me to the Wilderness Awareness School 9 month program, finding you under a tree one day, and yeah, starting to merge those worlds and those perspectives.
Yeah, so you had already started training parkour before you met me, correct?
Yeah, I was training indoors at Parkour Visions.
Yeah, which for those who don't know was the gym that I co-founded, but that I had left and was now training outside. So you'd heard of me, I imagine. Then you actually, I don't remember this. You found me under a tree.
Yeah, well, I'd heard of you through Parkour Visions and Marcus and all the people from WAS that were going to there in the early days. And then I'd seen your YouTube videos, the tree runner, and I ran into you at Volunteer Park one day
Okay, yeah.
under one of the cedar trees, and I was like, "Yo, Rave Kelly, I'm your internet superstar."
It's easy to find me in those trees in those days. I wish you could get down there as frequently now, but 2 hours is a long ways. Um, nice. So you were kind of like dialing into what I was doing a little bit. You came to Return to the Source in 2014. So this is 10-year anniversary of Return to the Source for you this year.
Yeah, wow, that's wild.
Um, and but you were teaching with WAS for quite a while after we met, if I remember correctly, right?
Yeah, so I was working. So I graduated from the Wilderness Awareness School. I went to become a wilderness therapy guide and kind of living out these skills in the bush with at-risk young men. And then I came back to WAS and worked for them for about 6 years, both in the marketing, but also as a facilitator for adults and youth programs.
I remember we used to train every Tuesday. Robert Lansdale, who was the other kind of early early coach who developed with us, does mostly back end work. But Robert and I would train every Tuesday, and we were trying to get you to come, and you come, and yeah, you're a little bit more hit or miss. But a lot of times you had to interrupt your training with us to take calls for WAS for selling people on their 9 month program. So
Yeah.
that was back in the day. So you worked with me and you came, I think, just one time as a student at Return to the Source, and then you came back and offered a barter where you would help share wilderness skills in exchange for coming. And so I believe that was 2015. Were you there? Yeah, 2015.
Yeah, it was kind of this combination of volunteer, and then yeah, building up those offerings and doing. I think it started with smaller things,
Mhm.
but then it developed as that relationship grew.
Yeah, and so you taught, the bird language game, which I was totally skeptical of, and you did some tracking skills and the fire making, which we did, I think, just as a skill on one day initially. And then at the same time, you were really mostly training parkour a lot on your own, I think. And then you were living with Tanner Walker, if I remember correctly, who's, I don't know how familiar people are, but he's got developed his own little approach, kind of inspired by Ido Portal and movement. And he's been a movement teacher in Seattle for a long time. So you were kind of imbibing the movement culture and living in a little community of people who are playing around with locomotion patterns and strength training and rings and, you know, uh, Charles Poliquin protocols and diet stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of the nexus of all the things. I'd spent a lot of time in the wilderness, and then I came upon you and your perspective and this idea of interacting with the environment and bringing movement into that, parkour in a sense, bringing that into the environment. And then, yeah, meeting Tanner and being in the movement perspective, but also really being heavily influenced by you and Katie Bowman's work.
Hmm.
Really kind of at the nexus of that, and then living in Seattle with this intention, exploring the idea, can I live out these skills both in the movement and the nature connection realm in a city?
Yeah.
And it was like, whoa, actually, the city has some of the best trees. It has the most open
Yeah.
spaces. It is one of the most accessible places for movement. And then the bird language in the city is insane. I was just at a park yesterday, and there was a sharpshin hawk every 20 minutes hunting the pigeons,
Hmm.
just coming through, and yeah, all the raccoons and foxes. And so, yeah, just really discovering that actually the cities are really rich environments for all of these natural skills that kind of get siloed away.
Well, it's interesting. A lot of us think of as kind of nature is actually tree farms. And they're kind of intentional deserts in a way because they have been managed by human beings in order to maximize the production of timber. And what maximizes the production of timber is often actually not what creates the most biodiversity and bioavailable energy that can feed lots of other ecosystems. So you can go through walks in the woods here, and you're going to be in a stand of Doug fir trees that are all lined up, and it's only Doug fir trees, and it's been harvested recently and repeatedly. And yeah, there's birds there, there's squirrels there, there's all these things there. But compared to like a really diverse, beautiful city park right next to the ocean, it might be much less dense with living things, which is kind of
That's actually a really, I've never thought about that, but that's so true that so many people will think they're in pristine nature
Mhm.
and they're actually in a tree farm.
Yep.
I haven't actually I know that, but I haven't actually connected that. I think that's a really a good insight for people to realize that this
Yeah.
natural environment is very much modified.
Yeah, when I see a stand of planted Doug firs, which is, set to be harvested for timber, and imagine walking through that. It's kind of like walking through a wheat field, right? If you were the size where wheat would tower over you, right? Like, if you're 6 inches tall and you're walking through a wheat field, you've got this massive amount of nature above you swaying in the wind, and there's all sorts of little bugs and things that are living their lives in there. But it might be hard to see it from that perspective, but actually you're living in a bit of a desert of life that's been created in order to maximize the production of this one particular thing. The same is true of these Doug fir stands that we have here in the Northwest.
Yeah, and as I think about that and related to our the way that we interact with the world, I look at these city parks and I'm
Mhm.
like, actually, these things we have the ability to modify these really unique and interactive and beneficial environments if we all got on, not all of us, but if we could get enough people on board with the value proposition of
Mhm.
engaging with these environments.
Yeah, I mean, in a natural forest, there's a lot more down logs and nursery logs, which create much more of a sort of a an environment that is interesting to move through, that has richer movement opportunities than a bunch of straight up Doug firs. Like I think the most recent video on your Instagram is a really beautiful video of you exploring like a downed oak tree, maybe, or
Yeah, it
something.
was a downed oak, but it was actually alive. So it had fully fallen over and continued to grow.
Yeah, it's gorgeous, and that kind of thing doesn't make good timber.
No.
So, you know, um, a lot of times timber companies are going to get rid of something like that and make sure that there's space for something to grow straight. So natural forests produce lots of deformed timber, which timber companies get rid of, which is exactly what invites movement. And so people think, oh, in nature you can't find cool trees, but they're not actually experiencing nature; they're experiencing tree farms.
That I think that's where it connects is like people I think that's the point. That's like the final insight is like, oh, we can't find these good trees in nature. It's like, well, you're not like you are you are in a tree farm.
Yeah.
Um yeah, wow, that's really interesting to think about.
So, yeah, back to your story. So you're teaching basically just one day of stuff, which I'm really influenced by Katie Bowman at this time. There's a bunch of different WAS students who are coming through EMP, and it kind of like there's a natural interaction between movement in nature and wilderness skills, and we don't really know exactly what that relationship is or how it could develop back in 2016, 2015, but we're
Mm.
starting to cultivate it. And the original way we do it is that it's basically just we've now moved from 3-day events to 5-day events. And like people start to get really fatigued. So we take one day in the middle and focus on these other less intensive physical skills. And that also gives me a little bit of a break. in 2016, I remember you came back. I think no 20 was it 2017? I can't remember. There was one year where Jamie Mock came in and did it. You weren't available that year. And then the next year you came back and I got really sick that year. I had Lyme disease. And so that was the first year you did the bird language game. What do you call that game? The
Nest robbers.
Nest robbers. Yes. How could I forget? Nest robbers. First time we did the nest robbers game, and I just spent the whole day feverish in my in my tent while you were teaching. Then went and spent the night puking at my mom's. Uh, but uh, but something magical happened that night, and we came back, and it was like a deeper depth of connection had been reached than had ever been reached before. And then over time, you started wanting to do ceremony, right? Like rituals, I should say rituals, to begin and end the event. And you started bringing that into the ecology of the practices that we were offering people. And then, your skills as a movement teacher were growing, and you were starting to coach online, kind of like working with Ben Patrick and his guys on the online coaching model. Um, and so then you started to sort of come over and do a lot of teaching on the sort of movement skill side of what EMP was doing, starting what, like 2018, 2019?
Yeah, I think definitely 2018. I remember really stepping into my gifts in the retreat and then teaching workshops with Rob in 2019.
Okay. Yeah, we send you guys on the road for the first time in 2019. And of course, 2020 rolls around, and
Wow, wow.
so last year we got back on the road teaching workshops again. This year we're really trying to grow into that and share this stuff much more widely. So how has it been for you kind of going out on the road and sharing it? What have the insights been and working with people, and just even the way evolvement play has evolved from really like a movement method rooted in parkour, but practiced in nature with elements of martial arts and dance and gymnastics mixed into something that's maybe not even best characterized as primarily about movement. How has it been kind of sharing that with people and the responses that you've been getting?
Yeah, it's really fascinating and super connective and curious. I've been asking this question for a long time is how can we reliably and systematically facilitate deep, meaningful connection
Mm.
with ourselves, the world around us, and the people that we inhabit this world with? And like, how many days do we need to do that? What kind of container do we need to make that happen? And through John's work and through all of the retreats that we've done together, there's some core components where all of these things meet up. And as a facilitator, I when I go to events, I see the lack of facilitation in people, and there's these layers of bringing together and sharing stories. So we're weaving a container of safety, and when people feel safe, they feel safe enough to be vulnerable, both in their movement and their emotional and their connection. And so that looks like weaving in all these practices of, starting with gratitude. It's like starting this practice. What's your name? What are you grateful for? And really dropping people into that awareness, and then we know the science that shifts your brain waves. It shifts the way that your emotional state, you know, starts to interact with those around you. And so we don't just start with movement. We start with this imaginal exercise of both introducing ourselves to the place.
Mhm.
The way that I've been doing is we introduce ourselves to ourself. Like,
Yep.
get out of your mind, land yourself in your body through some of the shaking and swinging practices. And then we go and introduce ourselves to this place, these
Mhm.
trees, the ground. How does this place feel about us? And we're going to be interacting with it as these are living beings. And then introducing ourselves to each other. in a very non-verbal, physical way.
Yeah.
And it's as those connections solidify, you see people really start to open up and relax, and they're almost unaware until they experience like a moment of discomfort. They become so comfortable, and then they start to do something that they're like, oh, like, is this okay to do this? And they're like, yes. And so as we land in those relationships, it's really through the partner interaction I find is one of the most valuable insights that people have. You know, there's no replacement for a training partner. And when you're working with another body, it brings up all of these things in you.
Yeah.
Both like, am I looking good? Is it okay to touch this person? Was I too rough? Should I care for them? Should I protect them? I don't want to hurt them. Other people are watching me. Like, am I doing it right? So all of these noticings come to the surface. And then bringing in John's practices, we give people the opportunity to express those noticings. Hey, I
Yeah.
noticed in this activity, I was really concerned about your experience, right? I was sacrificing my experience to make sure that you have a good experience. And we're like, well, that's really insightful. You
Yeah.
probably do that in other areas of your life.
Let's just take a second here to bookmark. When you say John, you mean John Vervaeke. Most everyone on our channel will be familiar with John, but John has been a huge influence on both Kyle and I. Um, and it's interesting. Like John has become such a hub for the integration of all these different dialogical practices. But a lot of those practices are not practices that he originates. Like the I Notice, I Imagine game. Like I think that originally comes out of authentic relating,
Mm.
but I'm not sure. And I think Aaron learned it from authentic relating uh, before he started to interact with John's work, even. So Aaron Cantor being kind of the other main coach at the retreats between me and Kyle and Aaron. So just thought it's useful to elucidate those connections. Um, so Aaron, just focus on Aaron for a second here because it's interesting because I came into this from a place where I had very high skill in parkour and particularly in parkour and trees. And so I'm sharing that with people. And then Aaron has his own practice, primal practice that he's teaching. And he comes over and starts working with us. And it's amazing to have this incredibly skillful practitioner who's bringing what he does to us. But he's got some Achilles issues that have made it really hard for him to develop his parkour. And so we're like, we're going to send him on the road to teach EMP, but he's got to kind of tweak it to work for what he has to offer people. And so he went to Asheville last year and he sent me a message about it. And he's like, we only did a little bit of tree stuff, Rafe. Like we did a lot of person to person stuff and the authentic relating. And then I got feedback from the students and they were just over the moon. Like Joel Smith, who's a really good friend of us who runs the Simply Faster podcast, right? He's a track and field teacher, an athlete, basketball guy, strength and conditioning guy, you know, loved my stuff because of the parkour. He went to that one and he's like, oh, it was incredible. I loved that. And so this aspect of what we do, which brings us in deep connectedness with other human beings and the way in which we are integrating a kind of physical language of connection, like Aaron calls it a yoga of communication, with these intentional dialogical practices. And that's, yeah, tell me a little bit about what your feedback has been, because I imagine we're still running into this problem, which is like people are coming to us and they're like, okay, this is like, parkour for hippies. Uh, and
Yeah.
they get there and it's a little bit different than what they expect, but then like they love it and it absolutely is moving. And so what is your experience of kind of the gap between the expectation that someone comes in with as they start an EMP event and then how once the dialogical and the connection starts to hit, that perspective shifts.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to convey the depth of these dialogical practices. And it's really the most important part because regardless of what your movement practice is movement, it brings up stuff in you,
Mhm.
right? Like the body keeps the score, molecules of emotion. We know that movement is essential to all of these internal processes. And when you're doing something, there's a story that's coming up. And most of the time, you don't express that story. You just move on to the next thing. Like it could be you're doing yoga and one of the poses you find is really challenging for you. And that brings up these insecurities of, oh, I'm not actually that flexible or my hips are really tight. I sit too much. And then you go to the next pose and you feel really empowered. And that thought goes away. And then you leave the class and you don't ever take the time to bring that information to the forefront and to allow it to permeate into your life in a way that like is reflective upon the type of person that you are and you want to be. So when we take the time between activities to both express the noticings in ourselves, and what's even more vulnerable is to express a noticing in another. Hey, I
Mhm.
noticed you were doing this, and to give that feedback, and then we can start. It's a safe container to practice these things that typically are higher stakes in other aspects of our life.
Yeah.
That emotional vulnerability in the moment of a real life situation, you don't really get a second chance. It might not be safe to express or to think on it. And I see the power in what we offer into a movement practice is that it's these opportunities to engage with your character in a safe realm. Like you can safely practice courage and honesty and anger and expression and all these emotions in a way where it's like the consequences are really low,
Mhm.
but as you can practice them to bring them into the other arenas in your life. And I think that that's not fully conveyed to people who don't come to us from a podcast. If they see a video, it's the videos are sexy, they look amazing. They're like, wow, that looks like fun. And people are coming from that. People are like, my life is too busy, I feel like I'm too stuck in the mundane, and I'm looking for this fun, exciting experience. And then they're like, whoa, I didn't realize how much i was I could learn about myself.
Yeah. For some reason, what's coming up for me is Ido Portal said something I really liked. He said, "You're a human first, a mover second, and a specialist third." And like so much of movement culture, what there's been a broad trend really starting with CrossFit, I think, from away from this hyper specialization of physical culture that existed really kind of peaking in the 1980s and 90s with aerobic culture and super long distance running combined and bodybuilding, and everyone's kind of bifurcating into their different spaces. The power lifters are over here and they don't talk to the bodybuilders, and the bodybuilders don't talk to the long distance runners, and everybody's like, your thing's dumb. um and then CrossFit was like, none of these specializations actually make a healthy, powerful human being. And that kind of like exploded into the world. And then CrossFit, I think, missed the boat a lot in like what that actually meant as you really got into generalism. And then Ito came along, and it wasn't just Ito, but there was Ito and me really around the same time, and MoveNet and Simon Sacker and Fighting Monkey and Katie Bowman. All this was happening, but Ido sort of captured the zeitgeist and became the figurehead of the whole movement. But my sense is that, as quotable as Ito is, and and he really captured it there, it still feels like most of movement culture is focused on the level of getting the specialists to recognize that they're also movers and they need this base of movement. And I think that what we're playing with at Evolve Move Play is like, yeah, but it doesn't really matter how beautiful your patterns are or how good you look on Instagram. Like, how is this impacting who you are as a human being? And that's been the thing that's been, for me, incredibly satisfying, is when you see people make that leap. Like, oh, yes, there's something sexy about being able to do a Kong vault. There's something sexy about being able to do a muscle up or a kip or whatever it is. But the reason that I'm so attracted to that is because it actually represents a capacity to change myself at a fundamental level. And when I start to access that and I can bleed it into the rest of my life, that's profound.
Yeah, and I would even say almost the Edo movement is a speciality of generality,
Yeah.
if I could say that. But it is this, yeah, it really goes, people are thinking that they want skills. There's
Mhm,
something about this thing that's being sold to them into their logical mind that it's like, oh, I'm going to this movement thing to develop how to be a better mover.
mhm.
And it's still a skill-based mentality, and it's hard to convey. It's like, well, the you're not cultivating like physical, you are cultivating physical skills. It's not that it's void of that, but the greater thing is you're cultivating, your character, which is something that can't be taken away from you,
Mhm,
right? You will lose your handstand push-up. You will one day not be able to backflip or
mhm,
do a Kong vault, but you can still be a courageous, honest, virtuous person. And hopefully, you've had many arenas in which to practice being the one who is. So, and that, I think, is something that is hard to convey through social media. You
It's always,
know.
yeah, it's always really interesting to see the social media that comes out of the students who come to our events,
Mm.
because I don't know, I guess I'm not paying that much attention to the social media that comes out of all the other movement communities events, but it does feel like there's this real, like, whoa, that was something, like, powerful in a way I really didn't expect. It feels like the feedback we get a lot. Um, and it's cool to see that, like, you know, it ends up feeling like the technical content, which is there, right? We teach people how to do vaults and how to jump on things and how to do any number of things. Even like all the way back in 2013, 2014, when I first started teaching this stuff, like I was really focused at the technical level. That's what I was interested in. But people were telling me that's not what they were getting out of it, right? It's like somehow I took them to my dad, the Sunray Shire, which of course is a magical, absurd place that nobody, like that alone just completely changes the tenor of our events because we're there and people are like, okay, I'm not in normal reality anymore.
Yeah.
And then we were on the campfire at night, and all these things can happen that can't happen at an event where you go into a gym and you spend the day in the gym and you all go to your hotels, and then you come back the next day and you spend the day in the gym. You had a great quote from Nietzsche that you used in your conversation with John Vervaeke. What was that about? Don't trust any philosophy born in a room without windows.
It was don't trust a thought born in a room without windows, and don't trust a philosophy that wasn't born walking.
Yeah, it feels like we could say, like, don't trust a movement practice that's born in isolation in a closed space, right?
Yeah.
Right, like the gymnasia, right? Like, I'm super inspired
obviously through John Vervaeke's work, to think about kind of the roots of philosophy and wisdom cultivation in the West, wisdom tradition in the West, and among the Greeks. And it's like the Greek gymnasia were outdoors, right? They were in open spaces, and they were, like Plato's Academy, the academy, the academos, was a sacred grove of Athena. So like the nature was right there. And then they put a place for everyone to run right next to it, a place for everyone to wrestle right next to it. And yeah, it's like somehow when we put it in a box, right? That's what CrossFit calls their facilities, their boxes.
Mm.
And what does that say symbolically when you think about your general physical practice as something that you go into a box to do, and you do it in a box and you leave it in the box in some sense?
Well, it's even further than that. So the way I've been explaining it to people using what you just said, people gathered in the sacred olive grove and they started to do these physical practices together that born the gymnasia. Well, people are tired and they're sore. So they start chatting. Philosophy, becomes a hot topic. The academy is born. Out of the academy comes the scientific perspective, and then now we are in AI. So it's like if this was the body born in nature, now we've gone so far in the other direction that people are doing their fitness in virtual landscapes.
Yep.
So you're not just in a box. That would be better in my personal view but now it's beyond that. And again, when I was talking with John, I'm like, what are the unintended consequences of this? If we know that shoes, books, beds, and chairs, and cars, and all these things, they have consequences that we're not fully aware of in in relationship to their benefits. So it's like, what is the long term consequence of a physical practice? Maybe you're like the fittest, most engaged physical person in a VR landscape. You have all the PRs and points, but it's like, what? Yeah, what kind of person, what kind of thoughts are born out of that perspective?
Yeah. Just for the audience, I want to ground some of the things you just pointed to. So I'm surprised how many people don't think about shoes, right? I see all these little kids running around with these absurd shoes with massive heels, all these things, and I'm like, their parents don't just recognize that they're setting their kids up for orthopedic things, and like the coordination challenge of moving this giant shoe around. And it's like it's so thoughtless the way that we treat our children's feet, as a culture. And what the science that I've looked at has indicated is, you put an arch support under the arch, and the muscles turn off. And so you're going around all the time with that muscle atrophying that produces the arch in your foot. Shoes constrict the toes. The toes are constantly being pushed inwards towards each other. So we lose full breadth and capacity of the toes. We lose the motor control. Everything starts to get wired together. So, when we learn to read, that's such a fascinating thing. Like, obviously reading is such a great psychotechnology for us, but we, you know, we become much more prone to myopia, right? We literally start to scan the world differently. We are more comfortable scanning, if we're in our culture, from left to right than from right to left, and our eyes are habitually doing that, which is, who knows what the effect that's having on the hemispheres and how we use the hemispheres and how we integrate the hemispheres. Like, the physical technology itself might be part of this, rise of the left hemisphere to dominate, right? If we're always doing this and ever doing this, like, motorically, what's happening? But the other thing that happens when we learn to read, we repurpose parts of the brain that go into facial recognition to recognize script. And so people who come from cultures that that read actually aren't as good at certain things as people that come from cultures that don't read. And we don't think about these costs at all, right? Memory, of course, right? Like memory is a huge art to the Greeks. We don't produce memory. We put that, hey, Google, you know, which
Yeah,
bank is
like
applying that?
maps is a big one. Nobody knows how to get around their
Yeah,
town. And I've personally lost my ability to spell words
yeah,
because of autocorrect.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so, yeah, so just to bring it back to movement is what is the loss? And I wonder if that is why our programs are so simple and so powerful.
Mm.
It re-engages these ways of being in the environments in which they evolved.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. That we started this conversation in some sense. I think I remember very much talking about connection, right? What are people getting out of it? You're connecting them to themselves, to the environment, and to each other, right? So we talk about 5 fundamental connections, right? Which is basically those 3 that you talked about: the internal relationship with the self, the environment. We just split that into 2. The environment is a landscape we can move through, and the environment is a set of objects that we can manipulate. Then other people, and the last is the transcendent, you know. Those are the 5 relationships that we're trying to kind of guide people back to. And there's a way in which all of it is there for us when we're in our body.
Mm.
When we're in our body, um, like really in our body doing things, then we can start to experience the whole experience of reality. But we've developed all these technologies that allow us to abstract things, right? We can take speech and we can abstract that as images, and then we can hold it over very long periods of time. But of course, it's not the same to read Shakespeare as to see Shakespeare performed. It's not the same to read Homer as to listen to a traditional recitation of Homer in its traditional ritualistic context. And we find ourselves so easily seduced by this stuff. It's been a big passion of mine thinking about this recently, because my older 2 kids are 9 and 11, and we live in a cul-de-sac surrounded by other families. And my youngest, who's 6, she has like 7 different families that she will run over to and see who's available to play. And so she does not want to hang out with us when she gets home from school. She wants to go see who's available to play. But my older 2 are not doing that. And I talked to my daughter who's 11, and she's like, it's embarrassing. The idea of like being outside and being available for play is weird, right? And and I saw this thing someone posted on Twitter once, which was, the smartphone cured boredom. Like, what is the tech industry going to cure next? And
Oh,
it's like you don't realize the externalities of this tech that you've created, right? Like, you cured boredom and you killed childhood. Video games and social media have destroyed childhood, and we have the most anxious and depressive and suicidal generation of young women in history that are being raised right now, because they don't have real friendships, and because they're interacting with this absurd virtual reality where everybody that they see is
filtered,
filtered, yeah,
edited, AI enhanced.
AI enhanced, and selling an image. And then another one that's happening, which I've been reading about recently, which is an interesting thing, is there's this bifurcation. You know, there's an ambivalence for young women about the growth of their beauty, because beauty is a form of power. Just like a young man grows really physically strong, right? There's a growth of the power of a young woman in her capacity to attract, but there's a vulnerability in that, right? There's not so much vulnerability in just getting bigger and stronger, but there's a vulnerability in becoming more attractive. And that happens for young men too, but not to the same degree. And so you see this thing, and so the internet tends to polarize young women into the camp that's like, okay, I'm going to take advantage of this and get as much power as I can and be an e-girl, and the camp that's like, no, I do not want men looking at me at all. Right. And that goes into gender dysphoria, it goes into anorexia, it goes into just suicide, depression, hiding, goth, emo, all that stuff. It's a lot of it is about the inability to solve for a sophisticated way to navigate these things. And all of that is properly solved in, like going to a dance when you're 12 years old or 13 years old and figuring yourself out, like just going out and running around on the streets with a mixed aged group of people. But like my 11-year-old doesn't think it's normal or like feels super weird about hanging out with kids who are younger than her.
Yeah, and I think on that note is, yeah, the normalness and the validation, like what I see in the people that come to our workshops when they're playing together, when everybody of all levels and all bodies and ages can play together, they're all feeling validated.
Yeah.
They're all feeling included,
Mm-hmm.
and there is like a kind of beauty in that, that the self-worth esteeming that you can kind of step out of the beauty and you can be like, wow, I'm included. People value me. People want to play with me. I'm receiving invitations. I'm having fun. And then the dialogical practices, I'm being asked about my experience. People want to hear my stories. They want to hear what I have to say. I want to hear what they have to say. And so, yeah, it's really fascinating. It's like I haven't really known the extent of that in the ways that you're describing it. I heard recently that the number two cause of death in teens is suicide. And that really shook me a bit.
Yeah.
And to hear the things that you're noticing, even as a parent who is a role model for movement and
Mm-hmm.
a community leader in this space, to hear that that's a big struggle, it yeah, really makes me sad for people far further removed from that space.
Yeah. It makes me really passionate about getting this workout because I feel like we're reintroducing people to something that we lost and didn't realize that we lost, which is just a fundamental capacity to actually connect with physical reality and all of its components and be real to ourselves. One of the words that came up here saying validated and things was realized. We are engaged in real reciprocal realization in these events. And that has been such a powerful idea for me. That's something John says. John talks about, well, I think that the origin of this thought for him comes from addiction literature. And obviously this connects with what's happening with the internet and all the craziness that's going on with the internet. But the addiction literature says that addiction is a kind of process of reciprocal narrowing between you and whatever you're abusing. So you have like all of these behavioral options that you have available to you. And then over time, every behavior sort of ends in how it relates to getting your addictive hit. And then things get cut and cut and cut and cut because they don't give you access to the addiction, right? So John argues that if there's such a thing as reciprocal narrowing, there can be such a thing as reciprocal opening up. And then you can reciprocally open up your relationships to the world, right? You can move away from that narrowed space. And then you can do it with another person. And then he could say that essentially, and he loves it. He introduced me to this Iris Murdoch quote that's been really meaningful to me, which is that love is the painful realization that someone else is truly real. And so So then falling in love is this process of continually opening yourself to the full realness of another. And my wife and I are in a really deep healing process right now. And so we've been sitting with each other for like 2 hours every night for the last 3 months and just talking about the stuff that we were really too scared to talk about for 20 years together. And that's precisely what's been happening. It's reciprocal, real, being real. And I think essentially that's what we're doing, where we have sort of cobbled together or organically grown. It's been such a chaotic and strange and unique process how this whole thing has come together, but somehow it has evolved into this set of practices, the ecology, that helps us realize ourselves and realize the rest of the world reciprocally at the deepest layer. Because even meditative and mindfulness and all that stuff, it all feels really good, but it's like, that's still too mindy, right? Like you can't rescue the denizens of the internet by taking them into mindfulness. You need to take them into embodiment.
Yeah. So on that quote of, of this reciprocal opening, right? By you being vulnerable and open, it encourages the other person to be vulnerable and open. And then the more vulnerable and open they are, the more vulnerable and open you are. And that's the both forgiving love and trust that you have to have, that's not going to be taken advantage of. So there's that aspect. And then there's the modeling that encourages the other person, that encourages the other person. And I think what we're doing, and this came up on one of our community calls, they're like, well, what are you guys doing for the world? Like, how are you solving these problems at scale? And my answer was, well, I don't know, but my hope is that this reciprocal opening, that if I come to San Diego and I teach a workshop, I now have 10 more people in the world that, if they can be vulnerable and open and participate with each other and the environment in these ways that show other people that what they're doing is okay, then they might do it. And we were talking about it because if you're one person and you're doing it, you're a fucking weirdo.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You're like, might be a sketch ball. We don't know. But if you're two people, it's interesting. But if you're three people or more, then you're definitely a group, and you guys are doing something that is scientifically proven and beneficial. And now people have more of an interest. So I think that's really where the reciprocal knowing comes in the impact. If I model that playing in a tree is as a healthy, successful, good-looking adult, and I move and I'm joyful and I'm not hurt, people hopefully see that, and then they can do that too. So it's the end of this poem I like is, we find each other more and more. And I think, in your example, kids don't have that. They don't have role models. They don't have opportunity. The things that they have access to are reciprocally narrowing them into the phone, right?
Yeah, it's an incentive system problem, right? All of these social media companies, their ultimate telos is to capture your attention as much as possible. And what they found is short content that's highly emotionally polarizing, to make you doom scroll forever, is the way to do it. And they make money from clicks, and it's driving us literally crazy. And it's driving us towards it is driving addictive processes that make us reciprocally narrowed towards the world and less capable of loving ourselves and loving other people and loving the world itself. And so what we're trying to do with Evolve Move Play is literally the opposite. We want to do something that invites people to fall more deeply in love with being. And we may or may not be doing the very best way of going about that. I would love to see our work like really reaching children and parents and communities, schools. But the theory behind why we've done it the way we've done it is that it's easiest to convert the people who are closest to conversion, and they convert the rest of the people for you. And so,
Yeah.
if
Well,
we have
one
enough of
thing,
these, there's going to be
sorry.
some school teachers, right?
Well, so one thing on that, I've been talking with Brittany and Daniel about this is like, okay, parents definitely know what their children need. Children need movement, they need time outside, they need all these things. But in a sense, because of the lives that they live, it's somewhat hypocritical.
Mm-hmm.
And so I used to teach children. That was my main life's work. And my hope is that if I can teach more adults, we'll have more role models.
Yeah.
And that if there's, one adult can impact a room full of children.
Mm-hmm.
But if you and I have the skills at teaching these ecologies to more adults, then I think we can impact more children kind of subsequently. So I
Yeah.
agree
We
with
want to create a
you.
generation of parents,
Yes.
that will show up and show this way to their kids and build it for them. But yeah, I think the biggest thing is continuing to get it out into the world for people, continue to invite people in, and as those people come in, they become those access systems. Like after I was interviewed by Jordan Peterson, I had a lot of schools that reached out to me and asked me about it, and um, I hope that it landed. I hope that there's little boys and girls all around the country who are getting to roughhouse and getting to do parkour because John Vervaeke became my friend and he recommended Jordan Peterson talk to me. And you know, um, hopefully, like as we've gone out and we've hit the road again, what we've seen is that the people who come to work with us are really remarkable people. And they have a lot of potential to get what we're doing out, and just getting it out. That's what we need. So if you're watching this is my pitch now. If you believe in what we're talking about, if you want to help us help the world fall in love, find yourself at one of these events. Um, Find yourself in one of our online programs, because if you can't speak fully to it or embody it until you've experienced it. I thought John was recommending us all the time before he'd come to return to the source. But once he'd come to return to the source, it really shifted how much he could full-heartedly say, this is why you got to do it, and how clear he could be in telling people why it's so powerful.
Yeah, and children are really good sniffers of bullshit.
Yeah. I mean, like the unfortunate truth is that like we're still participating in the machine that we're criticizing right now, right? We are on Zoom. We are not embodied in person with each other. And we're going to put this on YouTube and, hopefully maybe throw some clips up on Instagram, and we're going to be participating in this attention economy. And what I discovered about myself was that I get eaten by it. As much as I try, there's still that part of me that like when something goes viral, you get, a million views on something. It's like that little dopamine machine just starts running wild in my brain, and so I've had to isolate myself from social media a lot. And it's impacting my kids are really seeing it and feeling it. But the flip side is that they also saw and felt it when, I have an addictive habit of opening my phone every moment. And every time that my phone is in my hand and my eyes are on my phone, it kills the potential for a bid for for my attention from them, or my wife's attention from them. So that's something I'm going to have to come back to, how we build a hygiene of attention. in working with this poisonous, corrupting information ecology. But that's the topic from another conversation. You've got events coming up. So you're in San Diego right now. This will be will have happened. San Diego will have happened before our next before that we release this. What do you have coming up after that?
Yeah, so we're going to be doing our first embedded experience in San Francisco, which is a weekend overnight. It's a Friday night through a Sunday where we can fully drop in. There's no going home in between. There's no stepping in and out of the experience. You get a little taste of the immersion where we can be fully present with each other throughout the duration. Right. And yeah, so I'm really excited about that. And then the weekend after that. So these are June 7th through the 9th and June 14th through the 16th. We'll be doing the same thing in Colorado.
Awesome. Yeah. That's up in Fort Collins or down near Boulder?
It's in between actually, but it's closer to Fort Collins.
Okay, cool. And then we've also got, I think around the same time, events coming up in Cologne and Copenhagen for the folks over on that side of the world. And yeah, we got a few events coming up in the back end of the year of the summer as well. So if people are really passionate about what we're doing, try to get to one of those. If you know a community that you want to bring it to, and you know, let us know. I have another call in 3 minutes. So Kyle, thank you so much for joining me today. It's always a pleasure just for us to hang out. I am jealous of the trees behind you, and I hope you get a good day of playing in them and you're scouting for tomorrow. Enjoy the weekend of playing with all the cool people who show up.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. This was definitely very insightful, and I'm excited to move and work with these perspectives. So thanks everybody for giving us your attention. It means a lot.
Absolutely. Yeah. Bye-bye.